On today's Locked On Bucks, the offseason continues for the Bucks. It does not continue for a handful of teams out there in the league. So taking a look at those four teams left in the East and the four in the West, what are the takeaways for the Bucks? Do we need to jump to conclusions here? Are we being prisoners of the moment? Or are there some learnings for the Bucks when watching those teams still playing? Also, quite a bit of news to get you caught up on this show. A suspension in the works for a Bucks free agent and some coaching moves across the league as well. We'll dig into the latest coming up after this on Locked On Bucks.
You are Locked On Bucks, your daily Milwaukee Bucks podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
To Locked On Bucks, I'm Justin Garcia, joined as always by Camille Davis. We thank you for making Locked On Bucks your first listen each and every day. It's free and available wherever you get your podcasts. You can find us on YouTube as well, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. And today's Locked On Bucks is brought to you by Prize Picks. It's the easiest and most exciting way to play daily fantasy sports. Go to prizepicks.com/LockedOnNBA and use code LockedOnNBA, all lowercase for that code. Use the code and get a first deposit match up to $100. Camille, we've spent a decent amount of time taking a look back at the season for the Bucks. We're going to continue that in the coming weeks, as well as we're working on a few guests to join us here on the show. There is one that we do have confirmed that is going to take a look back at the season and share their thoughts with us next week. But we kind of briefly touched on the big takeaways, and obviously injuries are going to be the big story here for the Bucks. We noted some of the changes that just jump out off the top of your head of, hey, it'd be nice if they could incorporate this or that. But I think when watching these playoffs and taking a look at the teams that are left in the Eastern Conference, East specifically, I was curious if you were struck by, is this an odd playoffs? Are we becoming prisoners of the moment? Are there some pretty key takeaways for the Bucks? So starting with that and leaving it as vague as possible as I set you up there, when you look at these teams that are left in the playoffs and you look at the Bucks and how they're situated, I guess first and foremost, if we're just viewing the seasons in a vacuum, do you feel like the Bucks are in a better spot this offseason than they were last year when the offseason was just beginning?
It's an interesting question to think about, and especially thinking about the emotions that were there at the end of last season in comparison to the end of this season. Injury played a part in both years, with Giannis getting hurt in that Miami series last year and Giannis getting hurt early April and just not being able to suit up in the playoffs for the Bucks this season at all. So like the first takeaway is one that I've already known, which is like, you need some injury help. You need some injury luck for sure when you're heading into the playoffs, because these games are physical. Like, one thing that has really jumped off the page to me is just the officiating and how much guys are able to play in the playoffs. Like, we talk about it every year, but seeing it's a glaring difference of how things are called in the playoffs versus how they're called in the regular season. And that comes on the heels of a regular season where after All-Star break, we were seeing things officiated a bit differently as well. So understanding how much physicality is going to be allowed, I think about what we've heard throughout the season with Doc saying the Bucks need to be a physical team. But the physicality of the remaining teams is really standing out to me, watching the Knicks play and how physical the Knicks are consistently, how they're going after the boards. Like, you see that even with Cleveland, like in this Cleveland-Boston matchup, like, I have Boston. But one thing about Cleveland is that they've had a great defense throughout the year. You can see when they are playing well. You saw it in particular in that Orlando series as well, just the back and forth between these two defensive teams there. So like the physicality really stands out to me. In addition to that, just thinking about the regular season and how it's translating into the playoffs, like the Celtics had a regular season where you're like, they should roll through the playoffs. Like, you see how they played throughout the season, you see what they were establishing, and come playoff time, it's not like they were trying to turn a switch on. Like, they just continued playing ball the way that they have been playing ball, if not just kind of focusing a bit more, because we know Playoffs, every possession matters a bit more. So you have to have more focus. But the Celtics were the team, like the cream of the crop in the East in the regular season. And so far throughout the playoffs, I think the same has been said with them. So I think there's something to that as well with your regular season performance carrying over into the playoffs. Like I know we had the Heat last year in particular, where they're coming off a regular season where you're like, I don't really know what to make of this team, and they roll all the way through. But this consistency, seeing what you saw during the regular season into the playoffs for Boston, I think has been key, because for this Bucks team, there was a lot of inconsistency with the hope of being able to kind of not necessarily flip a switch come playoff time, but focus more because you know what's at stake. And it can be hard to do that. You saw times where the Bucks were, of course, lapsing back into some bad habits. Again, injuries play a part in it, but they knew what the game plan was, and there were still times where they just didn't execute. So things that stood up to me in the playoffs, just to sum that up: physicality, consistency, as well as just possession by possession. If you can make the most out of each one, run with that. So all that said, I do feel better about the Bucks this offseason than I did last offseason going into the next season, just because it wasn't as if they were embarrassed throughout their first round series against the Pacers. Even being down Giannis without Dame at times, the Bucks were able to at least keep it competitive. So I feel better about the team, but there are some things that have been standing out in the playoffs where I'm like, ooh, the Bucks are going to have to step that up next year.
I feel better about things as well, but I suppose we should add the caveat, because I had this conversation with somebody, one of the regular callers and listeners and viewers of Locked On Bucks, on one of my post game shows. In that, look, the Bucks are not going to be a heavy favorite next year. You know, when you enter the season this year, it was the Bucks and the Celtics in the East, the Denver Nuggets as well. But that's not going to be the case next year. The Celtics are going to have better odds than the Bucks, regardless of what happens the rest of the way in the postseason. The Knicks are probably going to have better odds than the Bucks. The Denver Nuggets, you know, we mentioned, hey, if they're done here in the second round, things could change. Who knows? But I still think Denver is going to have better odds. You got to assume Oklahoma City and Minnesota are going to have better odds than the Bucks. And Philadelphia, for all the talk surrounding them with the cap space that they have, maybe Paul George ends up there, maybe it's someone else. They may have better odds than the Bucks. So the reality is the Bucks could enter next season somewhere around the 10th best title odds in the league, maybe even lower, which, you know, on the surface almost seems crazy to say, hey, I think they're in a better spot right now than they were a season ago. But I do believe that, and so do you, to be the case. Part of that too, just to pivot really quickly, is some of the comments that Doc Rivers had and Giannis had as we saw them both address the media in their end of season press conferences at the training facility just the other day. And we talked about Dame and what the offseason meant for him, and Dame even saying, look, people are going to be surprised when they see me next year. But Doc kind of articulated that as well and said, you know, think about it. Giannis didn't get a chance to work out last summer knowing Damian Lillard was going to be with him. We talked so much about, hey, Dame didn't get a chance to do these things because you couldn't jeopardize a trade. He was locked out of the facility in Portland. But for Giannis, too, that changed his game quite a bit to have Damian Lillard next to him. And we saw the efficiency climb for Giannis, but really maximizing how you can pair that duo. We never got a chance to see that. And, you know, work in the offseason is one way to start to address that. So that's another one of those reasons why I think we both say, I do think they're in a better spot. Does that mean the Bucks are going to win the title? Absolutely not. Does it mean they're going to be viewed as favorites? No, in all likelihood, they will not. But I still think they're set up to succeed more coming into this season than they were going into this past season. A lot of us were, you know, you're just blinded by the trade of Damian Lillard, and holy cow, the Bucks got Dame. Let's, you know, put all the rationale and understanding of what this could actually mean. The negatives, right? Let's ignore those for now, because Dame time is here in Milwaukee. One other thing that you touched on in your answer there was some of the rule changes that we saw come about midway through the season. This is not to relitigate that aforementioned Dame trade or say, hey, should the Bucks have done that move? I think we both laid out our thoughts. Yes, they should have. As much as we love Drew Holiday, the Bucks needed to try something differently. So I even hesitate to bring this up, but if the Bucks did not make that switch and just had still a primarily defensive team. Does that change things with the way we're seeing the game officiated?
I mean, it changes a little bit. Like you feel better about it because you know your guys are going to be able to be more hands-on and get into guys. But then the other side of it is, okay, the other team can do that as well. Can you get a bucket now? And that's been the problem for the Bucks historically before this Dame trade, where that the offense just kind of slows to a halt. And even with that, thinking about the playoffs and things that I'm seeing with this particular year's games, something again that we know, and that's role players can really swing a series where you just need guys to be able to hit some shots. I even think about this Pacers Bucks series we just got through, and it's Obi Toppin, it's TJ McConnell. Like these are guys who are coming in and making really big impacts on the game. And it's not necessarily a bench player, but the role guy, because with the Bucks and how they're constructed, of course you expect Giannis, you expect Chris, you expect Dame to do their thing. Even to a lesser degree, probably Brook Lopez to make an impact, Bobby Portis, so on and so forth. But after that, it's like you got to have some guys to have a big game. Like we think about that championship year where we had the Bryn Forbes game, where it's like, hey, listen, we didn't get too much more out of Bryn Forbes throughout that playoff run, but it was a game that really swung things. And the playoff is nothing but a series of small sample sizes. So like you need like having one big game in the playoffs, like that carries a lot of weight because it's not that many games that you're here to play for. So the role players coming through as well, and their impact is important. Defenses as well, and that's something the Bucks need a little bit more of. I think it's safe to say going into next season as well, because you can see in the playoffs too, they're letting you play. So like if you can really dig deep and you can lock up, like it's going to be to your benefit.
And look, speaking of they're letting you play, a lot of that lies on the defensive side. But what we see every year in the playoffs, you mentioned some of those names. Bryn Forbes had that flamethrower series against the Miami Heat. Didn't do anything after that. It's a long list of players like that. It always goes back to the 82 versus 16 conversation. So we'll start to open up that can of worms and get into these teams that are left in the playoffs. What can we glean from the way that their rosters are constructed? What can the Bucks learn from that? How are they positioned to maybe do the same? Or is there no chance of that? So we'll get into that conversation coming up shortly here on Locked On Bucks. But it is time now to talk to you about our friends at Prize Picks. You can get in on the playoff action and win up to 100 times your money on Prize Picks as you and the world's best players take the game to a new level during basketball's postseason. We mentioned there's 8 teams left, so still plenty of times to take that game to the next level. Win up to 100 times your money on Prize Picks with as little as 4 correct picks. You can turn $10 into $1,000. Basketball, hockey, you name it. All those entries out there on Prize Picks. It's America's #1 fantasy sports app. It is the best way to get action on sports in more than 30 states across the country, including California, Texas, and Georgia. And if you want to play alongside some of Prize Picks' favorite players like Meek Mill, Sugar Sean O'Malley, you can find community plays under the promos tab of the app to view entries from some of the biggest names in the Prize Picks community each week. So all you got to do is download the app and use it today. Also, throw in that code Locked On NBA for a first deposit match up to $100. Again, prizepicks.com. Use the code Locked On NBA and you'll get a first deposit match up to $100. Well, passion, drive, and patience, that's the formula for winning championships. It is also what keeps your ride or die alive. eBay Motors has everything you need to maintain your vehicle and level it up to peak performance. Superchargers, roof racks, exhaust kits, LED headlights, and more. Whether you're into speed, power, or style, eBay Motors has you covered. With over 122 million parts for your #1 ride or die, you will always find exactly what you're looking for. And with eBay's Guaranteed Fit, your part is guaranteed to fit your ride every time or your money back. Because with eBay Motors, you're burning rubber, not cash. With all the parts you need at the prices you want, it's easy to make your car the MVP and bring home huge wins. Keep your ride or die alive at ebaymotors.com. Eligible items only. Exclusions apply. eBay Guaranteed Fit only available to U.S. customers. Camille, you hear 82 versus 16 bandied about quite a bit out there, and I think Bucks fans, our first real acknowledgement of that probably came back in the 2019 and 2020 postseasons, where you realized, okay, this team, 2020 especially, that 1920 season that was set up and steamrolled through teams during the regular season, you got to the playoffs and everything just kind of changed. And that was when it kind of set in of, okay, we need guys that we think are trusted shooters, that are two-way players, and that just don't fit this specific niche and scheme or system that you're running. So I think when we talk about looking at teams that are left in the postseason now and examining how they're made up, taking a look at the Bucks and what are some learnings that you could have, I think that's the number one spot to start, is when you look at that 82 versus 16 conversation. And to me, the big piece is this: you can get by. There are very few teams out there that are entirely constructed of every single guy in this roster, for the most part, are guys that, if I had to, we can play them and trust them in the playoffs. You always have some of those blind spots. But, to me, in looking at all these teams left, the big piece is in your top 6, especially, but 7, somewhere around there, you can really only get by with one guy that you would say, got some questions here. We talked about Bryn Forbes. He was clearly an 82 player, not a 16 guy, but he wasn't a starter. He wasn't a guy that was heavy usage. We talked about what he did against the Miami Heat, but Bryn Forbes was not heavily relied on by the Bucks. And that's the big thing, is where are these guys? Because, again, nobody's going to have a roster full of, hey, this guy can play big minutes and contribute in big ways in the playoffs, but it's all about how you hide those guys. And I think that's one thing that we've seen for the Bucks roster, especially this year. Part of it, injuries, everybody having to move up a line when you have the injuries that the Bucks had, 2 guys like Giannis and Damian Lillard. Part of it too is, again, those names. When you think about the money that Giannis, Dame, Chris Middleton, Brook Lopez are making, that takes away from the money that you're able to spend to fill out the rest of those. And having things like a biannual exception, a non-taxpayer or the taxpayer exception, that those play significant roles in how many of those guys you can acquire too. And to me, that's the big thing. As we touched on the other day, you feel pretty good, even with the injuries. You feel pretty good about Giannis, Dame, and Chris Middleton, but it's the surrounding pieces around them. And that's ultimately the biggest challenge for this front office, knowing what they're up against with the cap, is how can we find these guys when this is what we're limited with?
Yeah, because a lot of the guys who you would look at to be like, hey, they could be an impact role player or impact guy on this team, they're normally not signing for vet mims. Like, you're going to have to spend a bit more than that. So the Bucks are a little bit handicapped with that. But one thing that you talking about the 16 game players versus the 82 made me think about with the playoffs is, in addition to that, it's about being able to throw out as many different pitches as you possibly can. Like, for the Bucks, under Bud, an example, like, we knew the drop coverage was going to be the primary defense that they ran, so on and so forth. But come playoff time, if that's all you can do, like if you can't do anything else but play one style of defense, one style of offense, normally that's going to end up costing you, because teams are game planning. And on a full 7-game series, things are going to be changing. You're going to have to adjust. So if you have multiple pitches you can throw out and different looks you can throw out, that's going to be more beneficial as well, which when we think about that championship run team and how much they were switching, which was something a little bit different than what we had saw throughout the season. So that's something for this Bucks team as well throughout the offseason to be considering, especially since we're going to be really having the first year of a Doc Rivers led team, with, we call it this past half of season kind of like an audit, a preview of what might be to come. But you have to be able to be versatile. And that's something that stands out in the playoffs as well. And watching these other games, like, I know we're talking about the East, but think about the Timberwolves and how they won in game 1, and then game 2, they do not have Rudy Gobert, yet and still they hold the Nuggets to a season low in points. Like, being able to switch things up based on not even just who's available, but what the other team is trying to dictate and what you're trying to take away is super important as well. So having those guys who are going to be around Dame, Giannis, Chris, possibly Brooke Lopez, like how many different ways can you switch guys in and out to be able to play a different style that might be more beneficial? And also the understanding that some series are going to be certain guys' series, while other series aren't going to be as much. I heard JJ Redick mention it. I can't remember if it was on Mind the Game or Old Man in the Three. He has quite a few different podcasts that he's on now, but he mentioned one series that he played under Doc, and Doc just told him, like, you're going to stand in the corner. And that's really all that we're going to need from you in this particular series. But he was saying, like, he knew the next series, like, okay, we're going to play a team where I am going to be a lot more or being used in a different way in this upcoming series than I was in this past one. So it's about playing the game within the game as well.
And I mean, look at the Bucks championship run in 2021. When you think about the complexions that those series took on, that's the big piece of it. Is, you know, we'll talk about 82 versus 16. And I think a lot of times what can get lost in the shuffle is you just get this tunnel vision of like, this is the way that you have to play. Mm-hmm. No, you still have to have multiple clubs in the bag and be able to play different styles. In 2021, Bryn Forbes had the Heater series where we all remember he outscored Jimmy Butler in that series against the Heat. In the second round, that wasn't the case. Bryn Forbes was not playable. Basically, from that point forward, we saw Bobby Portis, you know, basically benched for half of that series. You saw Bobby Portis have very big, impactful moments in the conference finals against the Atlanta Hawks. So it is all about matchup in that, look, you have your best style, but you have to be able to play multiple styles. Yep. And that's been the challenge or is the challenge when you have a super team. As much as, you know, we've had this conversation, the Bucks are a super team. As long as you have Giannis and Damian Lillard, and it's a three-headed monster when we throw Chris Middleton in there, that is the challenge. Is you seldom see a lot of versatility with super teams because your resources are centralized into those two or three guys. It really adjusts what you're able to do with the rest of the roster, but it just comes down to, you have to have guys that you know are versatile enough you can trust them in just about any series. I mean, to go back to that point that we started with of looking at your top 6 or 7, look at the New York Knicks. I think it's the caveat here is, I don't know about you. I don't think the news is great for OG Anunoby, especially seeing
he's already out.
Yeah, well, but I mean, like, for the rest of this series and potentially next, I would be shocked if he plays in this series. And if they advance, if he's able to return before the midpoint of next series. But Bogdanović went down as well early in the postseason. That's a guy, has some flaws, but he is a 16 player. You trust him enough defensively. He's by no means a stopper, but he's assignment sure. He's a good team defender. He's knocked down big shots in his career. That's one of the guys you would shift into that. Yeah, we trust him as a shooter. We trust him as a 16 player. Same with OG Anunoby. Same with Josh Hart. Same with Jalen Brunson, even though that was a conversation we were having before in his Dallas Mavericks days. And same with Dante DiVincenzo. Isaiah Hartenstein, I think, has put himself in that spot, even dating back to his days with the Clippers when he really started to emerge in the postseason series against the Denver Nuggets. The Indiana Pacers, pretty similar too. All 5 of those starters are versatile guys. When you think about the Pacers, the big knock on them and their question marks of this team can't defend. They're a pretty bad defensive team. When you look at those starters, I don't think Miles Turner is the low post defender he once was. Mm-hmm. And clearly there's a lot of questions around Tyrese Halliburton, his defensive acumen. The rest of the guys, though, are good enough. And there are guys that you trust in those spots. We've seen that from TJ McConnell throughout his career. I think you've seen some good things from Ben Shepherd as well. Obi Toppin is still kind of the wild card of, yeah, I guess. But again, we just rattled off 5 or so guys. So they've kind of answered that question. Everybody with Boston is in that category where we say, yeah, they're two-way guys. We trust them in these spots. And with Cleveland, kind of similar conversation there where you have enough of those pieces and guys that are two-way players. So to me, the Western Conference seems like every single player on the Timberwolves, on the Oklahoma City Thunder, these are guys that 100% we trust them in these spots. So that to me is the big thing for this team. You certainly don't expect to be able to completely retool your roster and say, okay, all those guys that were free agents, they were gone. We brought in guys that are going to be better. But how do you start to sprinkle that in? Because let's assume you're healthy next year. You obviously feel very good about Giannis, Dame, and Chris Middleton while they're on the floor. I'm not in the camp that says Brook Lopez is unplayable, but I think there are exact scenarios and matchups where he works, some where he doesn't. But then again, that's where it helps having Giannis to say, okay, when we need to switch more, when we need to do some of these other things, Giannis, you take those minutes. So how do you start to find at least two other guys? Maybe they're internal and it's growth that we're talking about and progression. But I think that's the big thing is the Bucks clearly need at least two more guys that you say we trust them to hit shots. We trust them on both ends of the floor in postseason games.
Yeah, we trust them to do what they need to do. We trust them not to make glaring mistakes. We trust them not to put the team in a bad position. That's what you need. And like you said, maybe it's internal growth. Maybe that's something that we can see an AJ Green or an Andre Jackson Jr. grow into. And the thing with that is as well with this Bucks roster is thinking about it where it's like, there are guys who we have said with the roster are 16 game guys, like your Pat Connaughton, your Bobby Portis, although there were some people had some disagreements on that with Bobby Portis, but things change over time as well. So now the question also becomes like, are these guys still guys who you consider that you would trust putting them into the playoffs? Like I know Pat Connaughton didn't have the greatest shooting numbers throughout this series. And like, he looks like he might've lost a step athletically. But for the most part, like he generally was in the right place at the right time. He still does the flyby contest every so often that drive me crazy. I was seeing Andre Jackson Jr. do them too. And I'm like, no. Like,
that's not the thing to look at.
Let's reel this back. Don't pick that up, please. But you have to always reevaluate that every season. Just because you did it before does not mean you can be able to continue to do it. Things change as you continue to get older with schemes, so on and so forth. What have you added to your game? And one thing that stood out to me with the Bucks and the guys around them as well is who has a really quick trigger from three. Like that's why Malik Beasley, when he kind of got back into the lineup, it made sense because he had no hesitation shooting the times. But like even still, his shot isn't one of the quickest shots already. So that's a thing to consider as well. Like you have to kind of have guys who have specialized talents. And even with that, in this particular series we just got done seeing against the Pacers, we were seeing like Chris Middleton at the 4 next to Bobby. And Chris Middleton playing the 4 is something that I've had interest in, but next to Giannis, where I think like this could be a really interesting look to throw out throughout playoff series. If you do want to get a bit more mobile, do a little bit more switching, like ideally before we thought maybe Jay Crowder would be that small ball for this team, but maybe that's something that Chris can look to do next season. Maybe that's a look the Bucks can throw out there as well in series where Brook is playing, but like, hey, at this point, we need to switch it up and do some more switching, get a little bit more mobile, a little bit quicker, and throw Giannis out there as well. So, yeah, it's something to consider going into the season about what you're looking for and evaluating. Like, we saw these guys do it before, but can we count on them to continue to do it going forward?
And that the last point we'll make on that is one of the things you mentioned about Pat Connaughton and maybe he's lost a step athletically. He was dealing with injury too a couple of years ago, and for a couple of years now. That you think about some of the things we touched on with Chris, that long seasons that carried one into the next, over and over, and injuries. Maybe that has started to play a role here. Similar conversation for Pat Connaughton, but I think it's a similar story that 76ers fans conversation that they're having about some of their team too. And when you think about guys like Kelly Oubre, where you say, he actually surprised me. I thought he was pretty good, especially defensively, better than we anticipated, but we probably were playing him, to use some hockey vernacular, a line or two higher than we should have. And I think that's what started to happen with Pat Connaughton is he still has some of those value adds that he brings. He's one of the few guys that touches the paint, and his ability to drive and kick out. He's a streaky shooter. We've seen him Granted, it was the last few years, but we've seen him be able to defend up and bring some value there. But it's just started to become this progression where he's gone from the 8th or 7th man to the 6th, and a guy that you've had to lean on very heavily. So it's not to say that Pat Connaughton is bad, but it just becomes illuminated much more when you keep moving these guys up a line and asking for more and more of them. And again, that's going to be the challenge, to find guys that would start to take some of that share of minutes from Pat with the limited resources that the Bucks are going to have. But I do think that is a big piece of what we've seen for this team for the last couple of years. There's a lot of news to get caught up on here as we had all of this breaking earlier in the afternoon on Thursday, and all of it pertains to the Bucks. So we'll get you caught up on a suspension and some coaching updates coming up after our final break here on Locked On Bucks. Well, it is time to talk to you about Monopoly Go, as we pause here to talk about the newest craze to hit the gaming industry. Monopoly Go, where you can team up with friends for time tournaments, where you work together to build up each other's boards. And the more you win together, the more awesome prizes you can unlock. There's also much, much more to get. You can obtain unique stickers that you can trade with your friends to complete albums for big prizes, cool new playing pieces that allow you to travel the boards, and hilarious emojis for taunting those same friends when you smash their buildings and heist their vaults. Plus, Monopoly Go feels new and exciting every day because it's constantly changing. The boards, the tournaments, the challenges, a ton include their own unique mini games, digging for treasure, or a robot pachinko machine. And there are always new timed events that help you win big, like massive multipliers for everything you win or rent frenzies. There's always something fun to discover in Monopoly Go. So get off the bench and go download it now free on Google Play or the App Store. Game on. And if you find yourself constantly switching the channel because maybe you're tuned into ESPN or Fox Sports and you just can't deal with the screaming all day, we have the perfect solution for you. That is Locked On Sports Today. Make the switch to it now. It's a free 24/7 sports streaming channel, and it is programmed for you every day, bringing you the biggest stories without all the screaming. Locked On Sports Today brings you can't-miss analysis, opinions, news, and it streams 24/7 on YouTube or the free Amazon Fire TV channels app, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Lots of news to get caught up on here, Camille. So let's start with the first piece that came out, and that was, I believe, late morning on Thursday, that Charles Lee has finally secured a head coaching job. He and Darvin Ham, maybe not quite to the levels and an amount of interviews that Darvin and Adrian Griffin had, but we started to see Charles Lee's name as one of those that was always linked to openings, especially no sign of disrespect here, but teams on that level of the Charlotte Hornets. And he was linked to the Hornets a couple of years ago too, and interviewed with them. But we had started to see that name pop up more and more and more. So similar to Darvin, you knew it was just a matter of time, and that time is now. He's going to continue to coach through the playoffs with the Boston Celtics, but he is the new head coach of the Charlotte Hornets. And now you just look at this Mike Budenholzer coaching tree and the amount of guys that we've seen get jobs. It's not time to take the full look back on Darvin Ham, but Darvin Ham got a head coaching job. What Taylor Jenkins has done with the Memphis Grizzlies. Now Charles Lee is on that mix. I suppose you can throw in Kenny Atkinson and to a lesser extent as well. Boy, why am I blanking on his name now? With the Atlanta Hawks, Quinn Snyder. But all guys that have been attached to Mike Budenholzer at some point in these last 10 to 15 years. And now we're starting to see more and more of Bud's lieutenants as head coaches in the NBA.
Love to see it for Charles Lee. He was somebody who Bucks players, while he was here during his time in Milwaukee, always spoke very glowingly of. I love that he landed in the situation where he's not walking into a super high pressured position. Like,
Well, so you love that he didn't land in the Darvin Ham spot.
Very much so. When Darvin Ham got the job in LA, I was like, ooh, I'm happy for Darvin, but also, ooh, like that's a really tough gig to walk into for your first head coaching gig. So the same thing, honestly, about Adrian Griffin coming to Milwaukee, where it's like you coming into a team with a lot of expectations is really, really difficult. So I love that Charles ended up with the Charlotte Hornets, a team that's really looking to grow, where he should have time to really build the roster out the way that he sees fits, have some time, have some leniency as he continues to grow into what his head coaching career looks like. And speaking of the Mike Budenholzer tree, I just saw as we were recording here, Woj put some updates out that Mike Budenholzer is emerging as the front runner to become the Phoenix Suns' next head coach.
What is there any shock there? So that was the other coaching piece is you almost forgot about it because the reports started to come out immediately after the Suns were eliminated that Frank Vogel was already going to be fired, a one and done, and that became official in the afternoon. But yeah, I assumed that Bud would be the front runner there. We talked about the Lakers opening, and look, that's the other interesting piece is you go back to last year. And you think about the Bucks, the 76ers, some of these openings of, man, these are some good openings, and Bud didn't get a job. Look, the Suns have their own set of issues that they're going to be dealing with, just as we talked about with the Bucks and their cap constraints that they're dealing with. But that's a very, very talented offense, and he's got some familiarity with Grayson Allen in tow. I would assume Bud ends up there even before any reporting from Woj or Shams Charania came out, his ties to the state of Arizona as well. So you knew it was a matter of time before Mike Budenholzer would be back there on the sidelines. And I think a lot of Bucks fans probably thought, you know what? I will never forget the championship that we got with Bud as the head coach and Bud's whole persona at the parade and afterwards, everybody running into Bud at Barnacle Buds and everywhere else, Summerfest. So I think Bucks fans are going to be rooting for Mike Budenholzer. That the thought was, I hope he goes to a Western Conference team.
I mean, shoot, you've seen some Bucks fans, I'm sure, because I have already said, like, man, I miss Bud. Like, I wish the Bucks didn't get rid of Mike Budenholzer.
Yeah, the same people that said the exact opposite 12 months ago.
Even at the parade, I couldn't believe the fire Bud stuff at the actual championship parade. That was low, but yeah. Budenholzer to the Suns makes sense. Woj was saying that talks are expected to move very quickly and that Bud has been working already to assemble a coaching staff for a return to head coaching. So I do wonder with that, maybe does Darvin Ham go back to the bench, or is he going to kind of hold out, try to look to get back into a head coaching seat, or is he going to look like, hey, this is the season where I can get back on the bench somewhere else and look for another opening coming up? So something to keep an eye on as well, to see if maybe Darvin Ham and Mike Budenholzer reunite in Phoenix as well.
That's the interesting part is, we just talked about Bud's staff finding all these jobs as head coaches, that there's not much left. Darvin is out there, but do you go from head coach to assistant coach immediately that same offseason? That's the question. Obviously, it's a very strong relationship that the two have. 100% conjecture and speculation here, but even a guy like Kenny Atkinson, I know he is on the staff with the Golden State Warriors, but is that something where we see Kenny Atkinson maybe, hey, I'd like to go work for this guy again? So that's going to be the curious part to me, is how Bud fills out that staff that he has, and the few stragglers that were left behind too, that carried over when he left the Bucks. If any of those guys leave Doc Rivers' staff and become a part, because there is going to be change to Doc's staff. We saw very, very little change during the season, but it's a big group that the Bucks have. And I think Doc even kind of hinted at that, strongly hinted at that in his offseason comments, that there is going to be change and departures. So do any of those guys end up with Bud, assuming he takes that job in Phoenix, which I think we both are making that assumption, and it would be very surprised if that was not the case. So maybe premature, but congrats to Mike Budenholzer, who, again, I think all Bucks fans, especially knowing it's going to be in the West, are 100% rooting for and hoping to see success, as long as it doesn't come at the expense of the Bucks. And look, when the Suns come to Fiserv Forum, assuming this happens, very curious to hear the reception that Bud will get from Bucks fans.
Yeah.
The other piece of, go ahead.
I hope it's applause. I mean, it's a championship.
I would assume at this point, yeah, especially when you see, look, the grass isn't always greener. Look at what it took us to get to Doc Rivers here. The other piece of news, we talked about the free agents that the Bucks have, and the news on Thanasis yesterday with the Achilles injury that is undoubtedly going to knock him out for all of next season. Tough news as a free agent. And another one of those free agents is Pat Beverley, who we learned earlier on Thursday, if he does re-sign with the Bucks, he will play 78 games at the most, because the league has handed out a 4-game suspension for throwing the ball into the stands in that Game 6 aftermath. And I think they even made mention of his post-game interaction with the ESPN reporter as well. So a 4-game suspension for Pat Beverley. Were you surprised at all by the length of that suspension?
I figured he'd get a few games. I didn't know it'd be, I thought maybe 2 games or something like that, especially after I saw Jamal Murray was just fine for throwing the heat pack and everything onto the court. But
real quick,
I was like, it's fans involved. And I know how the league feels when it's fans and players. So they're always a little bit more harsh there. So when I thought about it, I was like, okay, 4 games, I can get it. Like initially I was like, oh, maybe a game or 2 that he'll get it for that. But they don't play when it comes to player and fan interaction with the NBA.
Yeah, I mean, even I don't think it was Mark Davis. Maybe it was Mark Davis. I don't remember who the official was in that. I think it was Mark Davis, actually, now that I second guess myself. But he was asked about that after the game, too, the heat pack incident, and said, look, even if I would have seen it, I wouldn't have ejected him. It would have been a technical, but I wouldn't have ejected him, because of there's so much that goes into that, and the intent and how malicious the actions were, that I don't think that's to the level of automatic ejection for that. It's frustration. It's a technical. That's about it. Entirely different when we're talking about throwing a ball into the stands at fans. I mean, you get suspended for a game or 2 if you kick the ball into the stands, but throwing it at someone. And then I think what probably got him the extra game or 2 was then he basically doubled down with the locker room incident. So that's going to be something to monitor, because I think that's one of the more complex conversations this offseason was you saw the positives from Pat Beverley, and you could see where even at an advanced age, there are some benefits that he's going to bring to this team and to what Doc Rivers wants to do. But look, I should be careful with how I phrase this. We've seen that type of player wear out their welcome very quickly, stop after stop after stop. When you run that hot, the hot water doesn't stay running forever, right? It eventually starts to get lukewarm and cold. And that, we talked very high level about guys like Kelly Oubre and Pat Connaughton of, I mean, you saw some good there, but it starts to really wear out when you push them up and ask for more. And I think that's the same conversation too with Pat Beverley. If he's your backup point guard and running the offense on the bench and organizing that and giving you defense, works perfectly. When he's starting and having to carry some of that defense alongside Dame Lillard, when Dame's hurt and there's no Giannis, and it's, hey, we also need some shooting from Pat Beverley. That's when it starts to look much, much different. Yeah. As we wrap up here, I think we have a couple of updates. So we're going to start to include some unique things on the shows as we got a long off season, but some individual views at players, basically, I don't know if I'd say a report card, but taking a look at player performance, where they excelled, where they need to get better, what to realistically expect from that group on an individual basis. We're going to start to take a look at that as we move into the offseason. We've got some guests that are joining us on the show as well. And we had an idea from you, Camille, to take a look back and go down memory lane with some players, teams, incidents, everything you can think of with this Bucks team. So it's not just going to be Camille and I talking about, hey, how do the Bucks compare to the Celtics? How do the Bucks compare to the Minnesota Timberwolves? We do have quite a bit planned for this summer, and that's going to start next week. As I mentioned, one of those guests is going to join us for, I believe, Wednesday's show. So a lot new looks here starting your way next week. And before you know it, it's going to be June, and we'll start to preview the draft and free agency. And then before you know it, Camille, it's going to be October.
Yep.
Bucks basketball will be back. So for Camille, I am Justin. We will catch up with you once again next week on Locked On Bucks.